In it here now, I'm gonna do now, I'm gonna been on here now, who bid $500,000 bid.
Welcome to the Legacy of Agriculture. This program will explore the past, present, and future of agriculture. We'll look at the people, products, and events that have formed its history. And now with today's guest, your host, Chris Bair.
Good morning, everybody. This is your host of the Legacy of Agriculture, Chris Bair. Thank you for joining us on this Saturday morning. Those of you that are joining us on Apple, Spotify, and YouTube, we appreciate you joining us as well. It's a cold February day in South Dakota as well as North Dakota in the upper Midwest. And today, my guest is Scott Bachmeier from Rame, North Dakota. How are you doing, Scott?
Doing great. It's finally starting to get a little bit warmer, Chris, and that's a huge thing. That was a long streak of cold weather we had up here.
I lived in North Dakota for 5 years, and you guys define cold weather much differently than we do.
Yeah, absolutely. But it's also defined differently on the east side of the state compared to the west side. I think the east side gets a little bit chillier than we do out here in the west. But yeah, I think they always say it keeps the riffraff out, is what everybody told me growing up. But these guys that go to Arizona, looking more and more tempting as the older I get during the
So,
January, February months.
so for our listening audience, today being the end of February 2025, over the last 10 days, what have been your temperatures out west?
Daytime highs have been right around, anywhere from 11 below to 15 below for a high. And one night we got here at 53 below ambient temperature without any wind chill. And it's been brutal. There's no doubt. It's hard on equipment, it's hard on people, and it's hard on cattle.
How in the world do you keep equipment running in that weather?
So I'm a little bit different. I'm the way that I feed cattle is all by a bale bed on a pickup. So I roll out just hay bales. I don't have a mixer. I don't have a processor or anything. I don't have to start a tractor, fortunately. So I take down and then line up enough bales and plan ahead, and then all I got to do is make sure my pickup starts. So good number one diesel fuel, and make sure it's plugged in, and I can usually get around and feed the cows pretty good that way. If it gets anything deeper than that, then I'm going to have to start the tractor up and clear out some paths.
When it's 30, 40, 50 degrees below zero ambient temperatures, one of the things that we hear on all of the news stations around, Scott, is it's dangerously cold for our livestock and for our livestock producers. Tell us what you guys do out there as ranchers to protect herd health, to keep those mama cows that are ready to have calves warm enough, and explain to our non-cattle people what that's like.
Okay. Well, I think it's different for each cattle producer where they live and what kind of terrain they have. So I live in the Badlands of North Dakota, and my winter pasture has a lot of deep canyons and draws, and we have a pine forest and a cedar forest in that pasture, along with some other areas of grazing. Right. So what we do is, and the biggest thing, artesian water well. It is 56-degree water, whether it's 56 below or 102 above. That water stays the same temperature and it continuously runs. So I'm very fortunate to have that. So for me, it's all about getting the cows out of the wind, feeding them out of the wind, whether it's in one of the draws, roll some bales down into a canyon so they can get into those trees and get some protection. Or, sometimes there is that darn east wind, Chris. That's a tough one in this country because it's such a cold wind and nothing's really designed for getting out of that east wind. So we go through a lot of that. So that's what I do. I get them down into natural protection, natural shelter. Some of the big guys that have nice calving barns and bigger places with windbreaks. You can see that, as you well know, the uh, uh, portable windbreak panels you see them at a lot of auctions, and they always go very well because they're so well utilized. So a lot of ranchers will use those, a lot of cattle producers, and you got to keep good straw down for them so they have good bedding, and food and water and shelter is the three things. And I'm fortunate to have that on a natural level. so I don't have to have a lot of big barns or the investment in that. So, uh, although I do have a calving barn that I put up last year, but I don't start calving until April 1st, so I'm a little bit far away from that. But right now, to keep the good nutrition and you get a lot of protein in those cows right now, so they can keep that fat on them and keep that protection level and let that rumen heat up when they get that food in their belly.
So tell me about the artesian well. I'm very interested in that. Is that that's not a well, it's actually a spring, right?
Correct. It's a little different than a spring. So a spring, we have a lot of spring waters in our summer pastures, and those are fed through more of like going kind of horizontal into a hillside where the spring water seeps. In an artesian, you actually drill a well, and this one that I'm talking about at my winter pasture, that I believe is about 400 feet down, and they hit a pocket of pressure that it pushes the water up. And they dug this in the 50s, and it's still flowing from the 50s until today. It has not stopped flowing 10 to 12 gallons a minute.
So
And
is that like a geyser type deal, or is it just
you could call
underground
it that.
pressure?
Yeah, when they drilled it, the rumor has it once they broke loose and got into that area of the Fox Hills water formation, there was so much pressure it shot up over 150 feet above their drilling rig, and then they have to neck it down, and then we use a valve, kind of control the flow, because if you let it flow, you know, all the way, it's going to run out of pressure. But it's been going for 60 years, 70 years now, so it is pretty phenomenal to have that because it never freezes up, no matter how cold it gets.
We had a land auction over here in eastern South Dakota, and we sold some pasture ground. One of the sections or parcels that we sold was partially tillable, and the majority of it was pasture land. And there's no water there other than a spring that runs intermittently depending on how much it rains. And in these great big pastures, in particularly in the Dakotas, I think we could do a whole list of podcasts of the
Yeah.
value of water on a ranch or a farm. But when you have something that naturally flows like that, it's worth a lot of money. I
Oh,
mean, it's a tremendous.
absolutely.
It's the difference between productive ground and ground not being worth anything. Would you agree?
Absolutely. If you have good water, that is probably one of the biggest things that, good grass and good water. I mean, we're in the business of raising grass. Our byproduct is cattle, right? I mean, if you look at that.
Yep.
So we got to make sure that we do correct rotation of grazing for the grass. But more importantly, your cows aren't going to grow if they don't have water. And that's one of the big things. Even our summer pasture, we had one of our artesian waters down there slowed down to the point where it was just barely running. And with today's technology, we put 4 solar panels down there, and we dropped in a solar pump, and we put it on a float. So once it gets to a certain level, it'll shut it off automatically. That thing runs and it feeds almost 300 head all summer long, just out of that water tank. So I mean, there's a lot of interesting new technology that when it comes to utilizing these waters or springs or artesians that may slow down. There's always something that a guy can do now to get that water back into that pasture for those cattle.
Yep.
And
Hey,
not
folks.
only not only that, Chris, but for the wildlife too. I mean, between
Sure.
the birds and the animals that go and feed and drink out of those water tanks, it helps them too.
Yeah. Hey, folks, we're coming down to the end of our first segment of the Legacy of Agriculture. Appreciate Scott Bachmeier for taking time out of his busy schedule to join us from Moraine, North Dakota. We're going to be right back in section 2. We're going to keep talking about herd health and bitter cold weather and bitter cold temperatures and how you keep animals healthy and fully fed. Folks, we're going to be right back.
Hey, this is Jasmine at Pfeiffer's Auction Realty and Land Management. Pfeiffer's offers multiple ways to bid and buy at our equipment and land auctions. You can bid online, in person, or place pre-bids before the sale even starts. By providing convenient bidding platforms, we make sure that you can buy the items or parcels you want the way you want to. Visit Pfeiffer's.com to see a complete list of our auctions. When it comes to bidding, go with Pfeiffer's. Nobody does it better.
Good morning, everybody. This is Chris Bair, your host of the Legacy of Agriculture. Thank you for joining us at segment number 2. I've got my good friend and also fellow auctioneer, Scott Bachmeier from Moraine, North Dakota, that's joining us joined me this morning talking about bitter cold weather and bitter cold temperatures in the Dakotas. We just went through a week. It's finally starting to warm up. We saw temperatures that finally creep back above 0 degrees. And you guys saw some weather that was 50 below and just a
Yeah.
shade more, Scott. And I'm surprised I get to talk to you. You're not froze to something somewhere.
Well, here's the thing is I found electric heated socks. I found those on online on Amazon, I think, and then for Christmas my wife got me these little hand pucks that have heaters in them. And so I'm telling you, when you put those in your gloves and you got something on your feet, you can do a lot of stuff in the Dakota Territory when you got warm hands and warm feet. But a couple of those mornings, it was pretty ugly. There's no doubt about it. And you just think how between my cows and my horses and everything, those are just tough animals, no matter what. I
Yeah,
mean,
they really are.
to be able to do what they do like that for, like you said, a week at a time on that just sub-zero temperatures is crazy.
In our first segment, we were talking about water, and you've got an artesian well that helps that flows water above 50 degrees
Yeah.
Fahrenheit, and that's a great flow of water to keep your cattle watered. But do you ever store any water above ground? Is that a possibility out there? I guess probably not with the temperature.
Yeah, not in the wintertime. In the wintertime, you can't go above ground with anything. Um, summertime, yeah, we have certain pastures that have large storage tanks, just in case something happens. There's at least a week's worth of water available for cattle. If whether a well goes down or artesian water stops flowing or something quits, we usually always have a storage tank for the summer pastures. But the wintertime, we 100% rely on that in that winter pasture. And then when we get closer to calving and we bring them a little bit closer to home, we've started investing in what they call thermal sinks.
Okay.
They're basically like single or double tubes that you bury into the ground, and they're very heavy walled, very well insulated, and they're heated from the ground up. And
Okay.
we've had really good luck with those the last 5-6 years. Once you get into that calving season where they got to be used, these thermal sinks, if the cattle are using them, they will stay open all the time. But it isn't something that you don't want to sit for 2-3 days in sub-zero temperatures and not being used. It definitely has to have that water flow. That's what keeps it opened up. But that's a great. You see a lot of people putting them in feedlots right now because they stay open all the time. You don't ever have to worry about them. So we've been putting them out in 2 different pastures that we use for calving situations, and that's been a lifesaver too.
So, are they just specially designed pipe, and how far do they go in the ground, Scott?
So they stick out of the ground. I think they recommend like about 19-20 inches stick out above the ground. The rest of the tube is inside the ground about 8 feet down. So overall, I believe they're like close to 10 feet tall. And then you bury a good majority of that in. And so I run the double tubes. And so they have a center one, it has the float and everything in it. And then the other 2 tubes, they all three hold water, and I think they each hold over 100 gallons each tube. So there's always
Oh,
that
okay.
storage and always the water circulating and keeping it warm. But I think the sidewalls, they got to be close to 5-6 inches thick on these things. I mean, it's definitely insulated well.
So there's actually water that's stored inside of those horizontal pipes then.
Vertical. They're actually vertical.
Vertical.
Yep.
Yeah, I meant vertical, but yeah,
Yep.
that's right. I never heard of that. That's really interesting. So the feeding process, do you notice that cattle intake during the cold weather is substantially higher than other
Yeah.
times of the year?
It's funny you said that. I do a couple other radio programs, and I mentioned that one morning, and I had 5 different people call and talk to me about their theory on this, right? Because mine was, do you feed by the pounds and increase the pounds, or do you just look at it and say, well, I feel bad for these cows, I'm going to give them some extra today? And all but one person says they always figure it out on the poundage side. It takes about roughly in this country, I'm gonna not everybody, but for my cattle, it takes about 30 to 32 pounds of dry matter feed for them to maintain through a normal winter
Okay.
per day.
Per day.
When it comes to 25 to 50 below zero, we switch our feedings. A lot of people will switch and feed at night. And that way that cow has that in their rumen, and that produces that heat so they can get through that cold night like that. And some people feed in the morning and at night when it gets this severe cold. But I move mine from that 32 to 35 pounds average on a day. I moved mine up to 40. I think it was 46 or 47 pounds. And I could have fed them more. I really could have. And they would have eaten more, I think. But you can overfeed a cow too, to a point where they're going to start getting, their feet will go bad on you and everything. You got to be careful on how much you feed them too. But that's
So
what I went up to.
when it gets bitter cold like this, you could feed up to upwards of 20 to 25% more feed than you
Absolutely.
typically would when it's above freezing, is what you're saying.
Absolutely.
Very interesting. You said something that caught my attention is that the rumen in their stomachs, and a cow has 3 stomachs, that helps keep them warm. Explain that to me.
Well, they're basically like an internal furnace. And, as that rumen keeps working and breaking down the whether it's alfalfa, or we don't have a lot of that. We have a lot of grass hay, and I mix in a little bit of like sorghum and millet with my mixture and roll out those bales. Once that gets in there, I mean, that's all their body does is produce that heat, right? They're working that room, they're working that food, breaking it down, getting all the nutrients out, and they go through it over and over and over so many times. It's that's what makes their heat. That's what makes them warm from the inside out. No different than a baby calf.
Wow.
If you find one that's getting froze down, they always say you warm them from the inside out. You got to get that colostrum, warm colostrum inside their gut. I mean, this is, unless they're froze really, really bad, but if they're shivering and shaking, they need that warm colostrum in the inside a little bit. Now, if baby calves get to the point where they're beyond that shaking, hypothermia looking, you got to dunk them in a bathtub. You got to heat them from the outside in, because if you start from the inside, it'll actually crystallize and it actually freeze up from the inside out. It's no different than taking a water bottle out of a freezer or really, really cold, and you tap it on the countertop and you see it all crystallize on the inside. That's
Yep.
basically what happens to a baby calf if they're beyond so far. You don't want to put that warm colostrum in them. It'll do the exact same thing from the inside. So it all depends on what level they're at. And, if you've ever raised baby calves and you have had to do it, you can just tell by looking at them what part you need to do,
It's really interesting. So when a mama cow or a mother cow, especially if she's pregnant and ready to calve, sometimes a little bit later in the springtime, so when they eat, the heat that is produced would be similar to you and I walking around to try to get warm back up
Yep.
again. It's the
Yep.
digestive process that actually keeps the cow warm in the bitter wind, and that's why they can stand in one spot for most of the day, right?
Absolutely. The biggest health that you can look at your cows, especially in the morning when there's a lot of frost on things. If you're looking at your cow herd and they have frost on their backs, that's a healthy cow. That means there's insulation there and they're not losing heat. If you see cows that some have frost and the other ones are just barebacked, that means something's wrong. There's a health issue with that cow, and she's losing that heat out the top because there's no fat in there. So frost on the backs of cows is a great thing. I mean, you want to see if your cow herd is in good shape. If it's frosty out, you'll know if they're in good shape if they're standing there with frost on their back.
That's one reason why I love doing the legacy of agriculture. I don't think of the 70 or 80 shows that I've done that I haven't learned something new, and I'm learning about it. Almost makes me want to go out and buy some of those high priced cows, right?
Oh, go do it. Just keep buying them. You buy them, Chris. I'll put them on grass for you up here.
All right. Hey, folks, we're at the end of our second segment. We're going to be right back in our third segment. Hang on just a minute.
Hey, this is Jasmine at Pfeiffer's Auction Realty and Land Management. Pfeiffer's offers multiple ways to bid and buy at our equipment and land auctions. You can bid online, in person, or place pre-bids before the sale even starts. By providing convenient bidding platforms, we make sure that you can buy the items or parcels you want the way you want to. Visit Pifers.com to see a complete list of our auctions. When it comes to bidding, go with Pifers. Nobody does it better.
Hey folks, this is Chris Bair, your host of the Legacy of Agriculture. We're back with our third segment, having a very informative conversation with Scott Bachmeier from Rame, North Dakota, the great cattle rancher up just south of Medora, about 50 miles, right, Scott?
That's right. We're in the heart of the Badlands, you bet.
It's God's country up there.
You know, it's not the end of the world, but you can see it from here.
We had a great conversation in segments 1 and 2 talking about herd health, cattle herd health in these nasty, cold, bitter temperatures that we've experienced over the last couple of weeks. And we talked about cattle staying warm and how they stay warm and feeding cattle in this weather. But the big challenge actually comes if you have, most guys will start calving sometime. There's always some early calves, it seems like, but calving season is just, for some places, is just a few weeks away. If we wind up having a bitter cold snap in March or the beginning of April, Scott, how do you keep those baby calves warm when they hit the ground?
Yeah. Well, it depends on your operation. There's a lot of folks. I have a buddy over by Amadon, North Dakota. He starts calving January 1st. And even in January, we had a week of a really pretty nasty cold snap there, but he has a whole bunch of large barns. So he calves everything inside of barns. And so his calves right now are, almost 200 pounds. So they went through this last cold snap. They had no problem because they were used to it and already warmed up. But, as you get into March, I'd say a lot of bull producers, they're probably done calving or in the thick of calving right now because most of those guys like calving in February. And that way their bulls are old enough for their bull sale for the next year if they're selling yearling bulls. So there's a lot of folks that probably have a lot of calves on the ground. A buddy of mine just next to me, all of his heifers, they just started here 2-3 days ago, and they have enough small shelters, calf shelters around that they can bring things in and make sure those calves are out of that wind and on straw or some type of good bedding. For me, I am a pasture calving guy. My terrain and the landscape up here with the deep draws and just the natural protection that I have, I can roll some bales down into a draw and the cows will go down there and for the most part, they'll take their calves with them and they'll just bed down in there and use the kind of the heat of the whole group. But when that cow wants to calve or is starting to calve, they usually try to go find some place away from the rest of the herd. So you're going to have to make sure that in your pasture, like for me, for my calving, since I'm a pasture calver, a couple benefits of it is I feel that it's healthier for the baby calves. I see a lot less scours, a lot less pink eye in them when they're out on natural grass, just out in the open. But it also is I have to make sure that there's bedding in certain areas. I got to make sure there's feed in certain spots. So if this cow decides to go out in a way back corner and have this calf all by herself, there's at least some type of bedding in certain areas of this pasture that they can get to. Doesn't always work, but knock on wood, I've been feeding at night. The old thing is feed at night, calve in the day. And that goes back to that rumen again there. Once they eat and their body's working and producing that heat to keep everything going, their body is supposed to not calve until the next day and when the sunshine starts. I've had really good luck with it. Some people say it's an old wives' tale, but since I've been doing it, I bet you 98% of my calves have been born during the day. And it also kept my coyote killing down. I've had a really bad few years with coyotes coming in, and since I switched feeding at night, calving at day, that's really helped that too.
Why do you think cows go off to calve by themselves? That's interesting.
Chris, that's a question like
why does the sun come up?
Yeah, it's like if you know why women do what they do, you'd be a very well published author. And if you
Now,
could figure that on the cow side of thing, I'd buy that book too.
Scott, on this radio show, we're politically correct, so be careful what you say,
Well, I
right?
didn't mean that in a bad way. I just meant you're not going to figure everybody out, right? I mean, my wife's right here next to me. She gave me the thumbs up with that comment. She's like, "You're right."
you, and then what's going to be really interesting is I can see behind you, and when she comes out with a frying pan and hits you upside the head, it's going to be all over YouTube.
It will be. That's fine. I'm okay with it. Yeah, she's right there through the glass window over here. So
So, what is the biggest preventive maintenance um, when you're calving in the springtime of protecting that calf and making sure that that calf gets going? When you see a calf that has hit the ground, or you go out in your pasture and you discover a calf that's hit the ground, what's your process?
when I see a calf that's just freshly hit the ground, I will stay and wait to make sure one that the afterbirth isn't over the top of their face and choking them out.
Okay,
And that usually isn't a problem, but sometimes that happens. I want to make sure the cow gets up and starts licking it right away. Once it
okay,
gets up and starts licking that calf, that triggers that calf to start fighting for its life and wanting to get up. I want to make sure that calf stands up and gets sucking on that mama cow as soon as he can. Then I know he's getting that colostrum that he needs, that vitamin that he needs to get going and keep his body warmed up. If that doesn't happen, then I will step in and either I will feed him colostrum and get that into his belly. Then I'll sit back and I'll continue watching this calf and monitor it to make sure that it wants to get up and try. If this happens also sometimes, the cow will not accept the calf. She will get up and beat it until it's dead sometimes.
all right,
So if that happens, that calf comes home and it gets put here locally. If another cow sloughs a calf or loses a calf, I'll try to graft it onto that cow. If it doesn't work, there's always people looking for baby calves for grafting onto cows somewhere. So a guy can always sell them. And I'll tell you this right now, Chris, I've seen some hot barn reports down in your neck of the woods, baby calves, day old calves selling for $1,500-$1,600 a pop. Day
wow,
olds. Yeah. So
is that crazy?
Yeah, I never thought I'd see that in my life. So there's money in them to keep them alive. But you got to do that. You got to be there for them. And when calving season starts, the sleep schedule is crazy. It's sometimes non-existent, and cameras have worked good. But since I'm a pasture calver, there's no cameras out there, so I got to go out in person and take care of it.
Hey, folks, we're right at the end of our third segment. We're going to be right back in our fourth segment with Scott Bachmeier from Rame, North Dakota. Hang on, folks. We'll be right back.
Hi, this is Jasmine at Pfeiffer's Auction Realty and Land Management. Pfeiffer's offers multiple ways to bid and buy at our equipment and land auctions. You can bid online, in person, or place pre-bids before the sale even starts. By providing convenient bidding platforms, we make sure that you can buy the items or parcels you want the way you want to. Visit Pfeiffer's.com to see a complete list of our auctions. When it comes to bidding, go with Pfeiffer's. Nobody does it better.
Hey, folks, it's Chris Bair, your host of the Legacy of Agriculture. We're back with our fourth and final segment, talking about we're coming right into the calving season. We've been through some record-breaking cold temperatures the last 10 days and talking about herd health and keeping cattle warm and getting ready for that calving season. And we had a great conversation with Scott about keeping the calves warm. Scott, I know that one of the greatest inventions in the recent past has been John Deere and Polaris and these guys that have come out with these side-by-sides that have enclosed calves with heaters in them. And a lot of times when a calf hits the ground, they'll go out there, grab a calf and throw it inside the side-by-side and let it warm up and dry off. Do you do that too?
Unfortunately, I don't have a side by side with a heater in it. I don't. I don't have that. I have a pickup. Okay, so in the back seat of my pickup, I have a whole bunch of old blankets and sheets and everything to cover the interior. But
Right.
if I have a calf that's got to go through that, I got to throw them in a pickup. I don't have I don't have the side by side or any of that stuff. So I wish I did, but
Either
yeah,
way, it works good, right?
it does. You got to get them warmed up. Yeah, absolutely. It makes a little bit of a mess once in a while, but you know, that's a small price to pay for keeping a baby calf alive.
I know in the cattle world, there's always conversation. You do all your calving out in the pastures. Some guys bring them into calving barns or into shops or whatever buildings that they might have. When you calve, there's pros and cons both ways. But the biggest uh, con to calving barns is keeping the place sterile, keeping
Yeah.
the scours out. Tell us a little bit about that and how to prevent that.
So what I did here, so I put a calving barn up last year, and I used it for mostly for calving heifers. I always calve my heifers here at the house. They are in a corral. When it comes time to calving, I want to make sure I'm there for that first calf if they need help, if they don't need help, right? So, uh, here's what I did. So my it's a 150-foot long hoop building, is what it
Yep.
is. And when the sun is out, like some days, it warms up in there nicely. It's like a little greenhouse effect in there.
Hmm.
And so that helps out quite a bit, which is why I like those type of buildings. Um, I have a sand gravel base. I don't have cement. So what I did is, as soon as the calf's born, I put them in a bonding pen, and that needs to be clean. Every time that cow, as soon as they're in there for 24 hours, they got kicked out the pasture with that baby calf. After one day, he's out on the pasture, get him out of there. That helps quite a bit. But when I
Yep.
clean that stall, what I did is I had one of those, oh, it's like a 2-gallon little pump sprayer that you use for like garden weeds. And what I did is I mixed up a solution with Lysol, and I would spray it down really good after I scraped everything out. I'd spray it down, let everything dry, and then I'd throw a little bit of lye, powdered lye, and spread that down there, and then put straw back in, nice, fresh, clean straw, and go for the next round.
So
Now,
what does
it
the
didn't
lie do?
always work. I did have, out of 100 and some heifers that calved, I probably had scours in 3 of them that I did have to deal with. So it didn't work 100%, Chris, but I think I kept it down quite a bit by using that.
What does the lie do that you
It's
lay
just kind of a
underneath the straw?
sterilizer thing, we use it, and this gonna sound like we're still back in the Jed Clampett days up here, but we still have outhouses around the ranch and in some of our pastures, because you can't always make it home in time. You gotta have options. We
Right.
still have outhouses out here because, yes, the power does, when the power quits, we still gotta be able to use stuff, right?
Right.
And we've been using that. If you throw that down in the old outhouses, it eats that bacteria away. It kinda takes all
Oh,
that
okay.
away, and it's something that we use for outhouses. It's gonna work for cattle too. So,
Sure.
that's how I came to be about using that.
It's putting a blanket or a layer between the straw and the ground,
Yeah,
preventing any of disease or whatever might be on the ground from coming up and getting onto that calf or that cow
absolutely.
or
Yep,
or or whatever.
yep.
So tell me, Scott, we've only got a couple of minutes left on the legacy of agriculture this week. Um, tell us, get your magic crystal ball out, and what do you think is going to happen with cattle values? We've had a fabulous fall for our producers, especially for our cow calf guys. Um, what does your crystal ball tell you?
No. Well, first off, it's nice to see the prices, but I wish the input cost would go down, because, with as high as the inputs were, the prices needed to be there to kind of be where you were the year before when you sold cattle. So that's one thing. My crystal ball right now, after talking with, oh geez, my LRP guy, livestock risk protection guy, and my rainfall guy, and everything else, they say that they're hoping at least one more year for sure. The prices are going to remain steady. Uh, the United States is at an all-time low for cattle numbers right now since the 60s. It hasn't been this low since the 60s, and that's concerning a lot of folks that way. There's not as much beef out there as there used to be. So I believe that the prices are going to hold steady, and I'm glad for that. We need that. It's nice to have a good year,
Sure.
right? It was great to have a year where we didn't have to stress out about paying the leases or paying that final fuel bill for the end of the year, and that was really good. After that, people are going to start building their herds up, and it's just going. I just don't know that the crystal ball only goes out 1 year, Chris, because I know people are worried about the tariffs that with the Trump administration that might cause some issues. There's some things with the farm bill that's going to be coming out here on the federal side that they're still not sure of. But um, I still think if you have good cattle, you're going to still have good value to them, and just keep moving forward with it. I think the crystal ball that I have, I think 1 to 2 years, and then I think we're going to start seeing that price correct itself.
Yeah.
All right.
Having been in the auction business for many years, some of the toughest, best people that I know are ranchers. They're producers. They're calf guys.
Yeah.
And I really take my hat off to you guys that are out there in the thick of this, especially in this type of weather. It's crazy how cold and miserable it can be sometimes.
Yeah. You see some of those anti-ag organizations try to make all these commercials against what we do and how we treat our animals. I guarantee they were not out there feeding cows at 53 below one morning like I was, trying to keep everything alive as best I can. All of everything I do, all the money I make goes into those cows, 100% of it.
Well, Scott, thank you very much for joining us on the Legacy of Agriculture. It's been a great conversation. I'm hoping that you get to come down to our March sale and help us be an auctioneer. I'll leave that up to Andy and the Bowman team. Folks, this is Scott Bachmeier from Rame, North Dakota, just south of Medora. Thank you for joining us, Scott. You're a great guy.
Thanks for having me on, Chris. I really do appreciate it.
Folks, we're going to be back next week with another episode of the Legacy of Agriculture. For a complete listing of all of the auctions that we've got in the spring of 2025, both land and equipment, go to our website at pifers.com. That's PIFERS.com, or simply give us a call right here in our office, 605-836-2277. Nobody does it better.
In it here now, what are you gonna do now? I'm gonna been on here now. Who bid $500,000 bid?
We hope you've enjoyed today's edition of The Legacy of Agriculture with Chris Bair, sponsored by Pifers Auction, Realty, and Land Management. Call Pifers at 605-836-2277.